Welcome to the Second Half Stewardship podcast. We believe that God owns it all, and our response as Christians is to live generous lives. I'm Spencer Hall, a certified financial planner.
And I am Austin McLaughlin. As former full-time missionaries in the United States and overseas, Spencer and I approach managing our personal finances through the lens of biblical stewardship.
Journey with us as we explore how to be generous stewards of our money, time, relationships, gifts, and experiences. Welcome back. Delighted to have you here. Today we get to dive into talking about debt. And as we think about our podcast overall, it's a sustained reflection on this concept that God owns it all.
Yeah.
As we think about debt, if God owns everything that we have, our money, our time, our possessions, our relationships, when we are indebted to others, we have competing claims there in some ways. And we really have to grapple with that before we take that step. Now, we'll dive into it. We're not saying that all debt is wrong and that you should never go into debt. But when we think about our governing idea, God owns it all, we really have to lay our lives before Him and ask Him each step of the way if we place ourselves into a situation where we owe other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
So will you dive in and share some statistics here of kind of where we are at culturally?
Yeah, I would love to. You get the data nerd to come out and share the stats. I like doing this. And again, we're going to dive into these hard topics. Debt is hard. But, I think in the United States, we have normalized the use of debt, not just on a personal level, but on a governmental level. I was looking recently, and the federal debt in the United States is currently 121% of U.S. GDP. 121%. We have more debt than we have of gross domestic product. It's pretty substantial. Household debt service payments constitute 9.6% of disposable income. And disposable income there is your income after your taxes have been taken out. So we're spending almost 10% of our income on debt repayment. And, some people would be like, oh, okay, that's not too bad, but it's a tenth of our income. It's what we should be giving, what we should be striving to give, but it's set aside that we are obligated to pay that to somebody else. There's no freedom in it because we have to give it back. And if we don't give it back, then something bad could happen. Of that 9.6% of disposable income, currently almost 4% of that goes to a mortgage, and about 5.7% of it is consumer debt. Think about like credit card debt. So it's pretty staggering. And then you think about how much the U.S. has out in outstanding loans. In student loans, there's $1.7 trillion of student loans outstanding right now. Consumer debt is about $930 billion. Mortgage loans are about $14 trillion. Like, there is a substantial amount of debt that's out there currently. That is just, when we are in debt, we are tied to that lender. We have to pay back the lender. And so it's almost as if we are chained to that lender. And that's what debt does, is that, again, it's not bad. Like I couldn't have bought the home that we are in that has been a tremendous blessing to myself, my family, to be in this neighborhood where we can walk to places where our friends live. Like, that's a tremendous gift that I couldn't have without debt. But the reality is I still have to pay that back. It is one of the first things that I think about when we have income come in is I need to make sure that we don't move money anywhere else until that debt is satisfied. And I think that's the challenge of debt, is that it constantly pulls us and ties us back to that debt, that lender.
Even in the best of circumstances. And we think about the trade-off between buying a home and renting a home or an apartment. And there's pros and cons either way. It can be a great step to do exactly as you and your family have done, buy a home, building equity, doing those kinds of things. But it's interesting that one of the first things that you say is it's still on a month-to-month basis one of the first things that I think about,
Yep.
I've got to have money to pay the mortgage.
Yep. Yeah.
So it does have that power psychologically
It does.
on us as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So as we think about last week, we talked about giving, breaking the power of money.
Right.
Prosperity has led us to greed, to covet, but giving is that power that breaks money, or it breaks the power that money has.
Right.
Where today we're going in almost an opposite direction.
Right.
If giving breaks the power of money, debt almost leashes us, chains us to money.
Right. Right.
And so we're going to dive in and look a little bit more deeply at how that comes about. And kind of our main thesis here is we want to try to limit and avoid debt.
Right.
Again, there are times when it's necessary to buy a home, to buy a business. But we want to try to limit it, avoid it, and then pay it off as quickly as possible so that we're not chained into that.
Yeah, and as we dive in, we've referenced Randy Alcorn's book, Money, Possessions, and Eternity, an excellent resource. And we want to highlight some of those things that Randy suggests we think about before we move into taking on debt.
Yeah.
And surface these as kind of questions of whether this might be true of our heart in making a decision towards taking on debt.
Right.
Or putting a charge on the credit card that we know that we can't pay.
Right.
At least not that month. So that first one, he says, is this a situation where we need something more than God has given us? And that's always a temptation. I mean, we've structured our economy in such a way that we don't have to pay off something that day or that month or even that year.
Right.
It can be a simple expenditure. It can be something large. But you look at the number of credit programs that are out there, and every institution seemingly has one that says you can pay this off over 6 months. I mean, even something that's a couple $100, you can do a payment plan of 6 months.
Yeah.
There's such a push by corporations to get us to spend so they can make money on us.
Yeah.
Regardless of whether it's healthy for us.
Right. Right. Well, and I remember hearing someone talk about one of those programs where, every vendor online has it now.
Right.
Buy now, pay over the next 4 years or 4 months or whatever it is.
Right.
4 equal payments of $25 to get that $100 thing.
Right.
Well, you think about it that time, and you're like, oh yeah, I've got $25 this time. But these people that were saying it were saying, I didn't think about the next time. So the next time I went to buy something, I said, oh yeah, I've got $25 now, not thinking about the $25 they'd already committed to the last debt that they'd incurred. And so they just kept snowballing this thing because the assumption was, oh, I've got this little bit, but that little bit kept growing into a big bit. And then they were overwhelmed by the debt that they'd incurred.
Right, right. Well, and it can be sneaky for us. Even sometimes we'll see folks go into a zero interest payment for a vehicle and say, well, I can pay this off over a period of time. There's no interest on it. And so it's debt, but I'm not bearing the load of the interest. But oftentimes what that can do is just give us the license to spend more upfront than we really need to be.
Right.
So again, Alcorn's second one there, God doesn't know best what our needs are. Do I need to go into debt because maybe God doesn't know that I actually needed, this trip? I needed a vacation that was going to be, more expensive than what I could pay for up front.
Right.
Or that I might need a vehicle, again, that is beyond my means, at this point. Or, other expenditures. Again, a difficult question, but an important one, I think.
Yeah. And if you haven't found out yet, Randy has a really good way of illuminating some of these things. And as I read them yesterday, I was like, oh gosh, that feels challenging. So his third one, God has failed to provide for our needs, forcing us to take matters into our own hands. I think this one's especially challenging because if the first two weren't already challenging, but this one, am I trusting God? And that's really what it's getting back to. Am I putting my faith and my trust in my Lord, or am I putting it into myself? And I think Americans are all about self-sufficiency.
Right.
Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Do it. You can do it. Mm-hmm. We have a really hard time trusting somebody else.
Right.
Which I think bleeds over into, can I trust God to provide for my needs?
Right.
If God knows my needs, he will provide for them. But this says, if I have to go into debt, this debt mentality is that, well, God hasn't provided, so I've got to take it in my own hands.
Right. And one of the examples that I think about here, we've become so accustomed to a lifestyle that might be beyond ours, that sometimes embracing just the simplicity and seeing someone embrace the simplicity can be jarring. So I remember a television program I saw a number of years ago. This was probably 20 years ago, where there was a lady on there who was a penny pincher. And they had brought her on to see how she fed her family. I think she had 4 or 5 kids. But she was feeding family on something like $20 a week. And the host was flabbergasted. She said, how in the world can you do that? And she said, well, we eat rice and beans 4 or 5 nights a week. And the host again was kind of up at arms that this could be the case. But she said, we have everything that we need. We enjoy the meals that we have together. It's very simple in what we do. And so the host said, well, if you were going to work with someone on budgeting, what would be your first question to them? And she'd say, well, how many nights a week are you eating rice and beans? Because that's about as simple to keep decent nutrition and to keep those costs down. But just that jarring example of, maybe God isn't coming through in the way that we think that he should, but he might be inviting us into a level of simplicity that could be for the benefit of our souls. It might not look good to our neighbors.
No.
And we might be in a circumstance where we're living differently, but that could be a great opportunity to be able to lay our lives before the Lord and say, God truly does own it all, even if he's not providing in quite the way that I would hope.
So the fourth one, if God doesn't come through the way we think he should, we can find another way. Pretty similar to that last one there. But again, I need to take the matters into my own hands because I've prayed, God isn't doing it, I'm going to do it. Fifth, just because today's income is sufficient to make our debt payments, tomorrow's will be too.
Yeah. And you think to James 4, where James was reprimanding folks for going to one city or another and saying, well, we're going to do business here and everything's going to work out in this way or that way.
Right.
He said, that's actually sin.
Yeah.
We don't know what the future holds. We need to be very open in terms of our posture with the Lord, because he may ask us to do something different. He may direct us in a different way. Our business ventures may not turn out as we hope.
So the last one, our circumstances will not change. Our health will be good. We will keep our present job. Our salary will keep up with inflation, and God won't direct us to another job with a lower salary or lead us to increase our giving. And again, it's that I think that everything will always get better.
Yeah.
It's that eternal optimist saying it's always going to get better. I will always have my job. And I think you look over 100 years of history in America, and that's not guaranteed.
Right.
Your salary isn't always going to keep up with inflation.
Right.
God, working on staff with Christian ministries, the number of times that I heard from fellow staff people on staff with Crew, God called me out of the business world and into Crew ministry. And I can guarantee you they were not making as much money with Crew as they were in their business venture.
Sure.
And it's just, you don't know what God's calling you to.
Right.
So to bank everything on, well, I've got it right now, so I'll have it next month. I'll have it the month after. It goes back to trusting myself and not putting my faith in God.
Right.
That God could be calling me to increase my giving or change my lifestyle or pursue simplicity.
Right.
But if I have debt, I can't pursue simplicity because I'm chained to that debt.
Right. And we come back to, there are circumstances where, we lay that before the Lord. We are very patient, and we do think that it can be wise.
Yeah.
But we have to be very cognizant of the other side of the coin.
Right.
And that's one of the ways that we get into our main text today, which is the overarching theme, I think, of the conversation, Proverbs 22:7, which says, "The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is the slave of the lender.
Debt makes us a slave to the lender.
Right.
Like I was saying earlier, my mortgage payment is one of the first things that I think about every month.
Yeah.
It's making sure once it's getting close to the end of the month, okay, do we have the money in it to cover? If not, let's pull some from savings. We're trying to, we try to be aggressive in putting what is into savings. So, but it's always on my mind at the end of the month.
Yeah.
And I am a slave to that mortgage payment.
Right.
And yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny. One of the things that struck me just thinking back politically in the 1990s, there's a Democratic political advisor, kind of famed, James Carville. He said, quote, "I used to think that if there were reincarnation, I wanted to come back as the president or the Pope or a 400 baseball hitter. But now I would like to come back as the bond market because you can intimidate anybody." And of course, the bond market is essentially the lenders who have lent to the borrowers. And the thing that Carville is referencing there were a lot of policy things that he wanted to explore, but they were completely shot down because the bond market would respond negatively.
Right.
Those people who are the lenders have a tremendous influence over all of society because they say, you've got to pay us back. Right. Number one priority, you've got to pay us back.
Right.
So whether it is on a personal level or even whether we think societally, the borrower is the slave to the lender there.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think it's interesting too, as I think about this proverb and kind of the context of the Old Testament. And we'll talk about how God wants Israel to interact with each other. But one of the things as I was reading just these different passages is that when God calls us to give money to each other, to the family of faith, he explicitly says, don't charge interest to your brother and sister.
Right.
Because he knows that by doing that, you're enslaving your brother and sister in Christ.
Right.
And so it's just a really challenging thing of like, well, if Spencer needs money, I need to just give it to him, no strings attached. Like, I don't need to just be like, okay, you're in poverty, so I'm going to give you this, but I expect it back at 5%.
Yeah.
Like, God knows the power that lending has.
Right.
And so he wants the people of Israel to love and serve one another in such a way that is different than the economic marketplace of today, where it's constantly back and forth of, I'm going to make you my slave and you're going to make me yours through giving and lending. And it's just so interesting to think about that in the context of Proverbs and in the context of the Old Testament too.
When we think about debt, sometimes it is necessary, but we want to pay it back quickly and we want to be as much at rest in the terms that we can.
Right.
So if we're giving to a friend, that's a wonderful thing. If we have to set up some kind of a repayment element, could think about that, but we want to make sure that we're not enslaving our brother or sister any more than need be. Ideally, we don't want to have them feeling like they have a high interest rate.
Right.
Where it bears on their minds any more than it really needs to.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's generous ways that we can be with one another and set flexible payments. Like I think there's ways that we cannot enslave our brothers and sisters and still be generous with them.
Right.
And it comes back to whose resources are they?
Right.
The resources are God's. They're always God's. They always have been God's.
Right.
He owns it all.
Right.
So if at some point he says, free the loan, free the loan.
Right. Well, and that's the whole principle of Jubilee.
Yeah.
From the Old Testament, it's a sense of if we recognize in a brother or sister that they have a legitimate need.
Yeah.
We don't need to be holding things over them if at all possible.
Yeah.
If we could just release it and say God owns it all, whether it's in my hands or his hands or her hands, what a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's pivot here and talk about another Old Testament passage, Exodus 20:17. Can you unpack context and kind of why we're going in this direction as well?
Yeah. So we are in the 10 Commandments. God is giving them to Israel at this time. And again, the 10 Commandments are intended, as well as the law, it's intended to be instructive for how Israel is to be a people that reflect God to all the neighboring peoples around.
Right.
So it's not just, hey, do this, don't do this, but by doing this and by not doing this, then you will show the people what God is like. So how do you show that God is not covetous or greedy? Well, Exodus 20:17 says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that's your neighbor's."
Right.
If we are to show that God is generous and loving and kind and abundant in love, well, if I'm coveting,
Right.
that doesn't show a kind and generous Father that's provided for me.
Right.
If I'm constantly wanting more,
Right.
then it doesn't show a trust in that God, in the Father that loves me and has provided.
Right. There's no faith that's being evidenced there.
Yeah.
And this is so easy as we think about our lives as Americans and we look around at the people around us, and they may have, this vacation that they're headed on, or this vehicle, or this home, or toys, or whatever it might be. It's so easy to get into that comparison game and think, okay, well, I need that too. I'm going to buy that, and that can be one of those elements that leads us into debt.
Yeah. When we were in Indianapolis a couple weeks ago, one of the guys in this fellowship program that we're a part of right now said, buying what you cannot afford simply to have more future trash. He called all of our stuff future trash.
Yeah.
And I just thought about that and I was like, oh yeah, everything is future trash.
Yeah.
And I think if I put all of the stuff that I have into that context, it's all future trash.
Right.
It makes me slow down and be like, oh, do I really need it?
Right.
If it's just going to enter my pocket to then go to the trash can, or go to somebody else to then go to the trash can,
right,
it puts that buying into perspective, and it helps be a check.
Well, and I even think about, if we don't buy it, then it can create more community, because if I want to go out on the water with my kids and I don't have a paddle board, but my friend who's 2 blocks down the street does have one, maybe I need to give him a call and say, could I borrow your paddle board?
Right.
Maybe that would lead to a deeper relationship with that friend.
Yeah.
Because usually if someone asks to borrow something from Emily and I, there's actually a joy that we can share it.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes that runs counter, and the other side of things of asking can feel uncomfortable, because we're so committed to our individualism and not needing anything from anybody. But this can, again, break down some of those barriers of relationship by just saying, hey, you have really fun toys. Could I, borrow, one of those toys? Or, lawn equipment or whatever it might be, that we need.
Well, and I think it's so funny, the dissonance there that you mentioned, like when you and Emily lend somebody something, it gives you great joy to lend it.
Right.
But to ask for it produces great anxiety.
Yeah.
And I'm the same way. It's like, if someone asks for anything, it's, go ahead, take it, bring it back. If you break it, then let's try to fix it together. It's like, it's just stuff.
Right.
But it gives me great joy to lend. But when I think about asking somebody for something, it's like, ugh, should I do it? Yeah. It's so funny that brain game that we play. But it is true. It does create that deeper relationship when I can be with my friends and enjoy the things that they have and learn about those things.
Right.
Because typically if they have it, they enjoy it and they're passionate about it.
Right.
And so they can teach me about it and about how to use it and how to really enjoy it.
Right.
Whereas if I just go on Amazon and buy one for myself, I may not use it because I may get frustrated with it.
Yeah, I might use it one time. So that's not for me.
Yeah.
Or may use it very sparingly.
Yeah.
But I think as we come back to kind of drawing the episode together, I have those similar thoughts even as I think about buying the business from my father a few years ago. I have the best lender one could have. My father, great relationship with him. We have terms in terms of how I pay him off for buying the business. I didn't have the funds to buy the business at the time, and so paying him off over a 7 or 8 year period. I have an incredible relationship with him. Again, there's no desire that he would have to be holding this over me.
Yeah.
And yet, it's still something that's on my mind.
Absolutely.
Every quarter, when I make that payment, it's on my mind, and I know that I'll have much more just psychological freedom once we get to the end of that.
Yeah.
I'll have paid him off. I'll have been the faithful son, so to speak.
Right.
Right. And even if everything, went terrible and I wasn't able to pay off the last few payments, I don't think it would impact our relationship much. Yet, because it's debt, there's still a power over me of that. And as we think about what our governing theme, again, God owns it all. Even the best debt, even the debt that, there's no way I was going to be able to buy the business. I have an incredible lender. It still presents a competing interest there, even if it's just psychologically.
Right. All right. So to close this off, thanks for sharing about your dad, Spencer.
Yeah.
And that loan. It's really helpful to think about debt in that regard and how it still can keep us in slavery, but it provides some opportunities.
Yeah.
So we get 2 quotes. I'll start off with the one from Thomas à Kempis. He says, "Let temporal things serve your use, but the eternal be the object of your desire."
Yeah, so good to think really about the eternal purpose and whether these decisions that we make that might contribute to debt, whether they serve that purpose. Second one that we really like, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. We always pay dearly for chasing after what is cheap. And so often the toys that we pursue, the things that we pursue in our time here can tend to be very cheap, particularly if we're financing them with debt, but we pay dearly for them over time.
We do.
So we will wrap this part up. Again, thanks for joining us. We get into the really exciting topic of taxes next time. So we'll be diving into what we think is a biblical approach to the way that we think about taxes and paying taxes. So until then, hope you have a great couple of weeks, and we'll check in then. Take care.
This content was provided by Second Half Stewardship. We are in Knoxville, Tennessee, and you can visit our website at www.secondhalfstewardship.com. The information in this recording is intended for general educational and informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advisory, financial planning, legal, tax, or other professional advice based on your specific situation. Please consult your professional advisor before taking any action based on its contents.